Part 6 We Scholars, Aphorism 204. At the risk that moralizing will hereto prove to be what is and has always been, namely, undismayed Montier se plaint, as Balzac says, I would like to venture to combat a harmful and improper displacement of the order of rank between science and philosophy, which is today quite unnoticed, and as if with a perfect good conscience, threatening to become established. In my view, it is only from one's experience. Always means bad experience, does it not? That one can acquire the right to speak on such a higher question of rank. Otherwise, one will talk like a blind man about colors, or like women and artists against science. Oh, this wicked science! Their modesty and instincts sigh. It always exposes the facts. The Declaration of Independence of the man of science, his emancipation from philosophy, is one of the more subtle after effects of the democratic form and formlessness of life. The self glorification and presumption of the scholar now stands everywhere in full bloom, and in its finest springtime, which does not mean to say that in this case self praise smells sweetly. Away with all masters. That is what the plebeian instinct desires here too. And now that science has most sufficiently re- resisted theology, whose handmaid it was for long ago, it is now, with great high spirits and a plentiful lack of understanding, taking it upon itself to lay down laws for philosophy. If it wants to play the master, what am I saying? To play the philosopher itself. My memory, the memory of a man of science, if I may say so, is full of ignorant naiveties. I have heard about philosophy and philosophers from young scientists and old physicians, not to speak of the most cultured and conceited of all scholars, the philologists and schoolmen, who are both by profession. Now it was the specialist and jobbing workman who instinctively opposed synthetic undertakings and capacities in general. Now the industrious laborer who had got a sense of the odium and noble luxury in the philosopher's physical economy, and felt wronged and diminished by it. Now it was that color, blindness, and of the utility man who sees in philosophy nothing but a series of refuted systems and a wasteful expenditure which benefits nobody. Now a fear of disgust, mysticism, and a rectification of the frontiers of knowledge leaped out. Now a disrespect for an individual philosopher which had involuntarily generalized itself into a disrespect for philosophy. Finally, what I have found most frequently among young scholars was that behind the arrogant disdain for philosophy there lie the evil after effect of a philosopher himself, from whom they had to be sure withdrawn their allegiance, without, however, having gone free from the spell of this disparaging evaluation of other philosophers, the result being a feeling of ill humor towards philosophy in general. This is the sort of after effect which it seems to me Schopenhauer, for example, has had on Germany in recent years, with his unintelligent rage against Hegel, who succeeded in disconnecting the entire last generation of Germans from German culture, which culture was, all things considered, a high point and divinatory refinement of historical sense. But Schopenhauer himself was in precisely this respect poor, unreceptive, and un-German to the point of genius. In general and broadly speaking, it may have been, above all the human, all too human element, in the sort of poverty of the most recent philosophy itself, which has been most thoroughly prejudicial to respect for philosophy, and has opened the gates to the instinct of the plebeian. For one must admit how completely the whole species of a Heraclitus, a Plato, a Empedocles, and whatever else these royal and splendid hermits of the spirit were called, is lacking in our modern world. And to what degree, in the in the face of such representatives of philosophy as are, thanks to fashion, at present as completely on top as they are completely abysmal. In Germany, for example, the two lions of Berlin, the anarchist Eugene Düring and the amalgamist Eduard von Hartmann. A worthy man of science is justified in feeling he is of a better species in descent. It is, in particular, the right of the sight of those hodgepodge philosophers who call themselves philosophers of reality or positivists, which is capable of implanting a perilous mistrust in the soul of an ambitious young scholar. These gentlemen are at best scholars and specialists themselves. That fact is palpable. They are one and all defeated men brought back under the sway of science, who at some time or another demanded more of themselves without having the right to this more and the responsibility that goes with it, and who now honorably, wrathfully, revengefully, represent by word and deed the unbelief and the lordly task and lordliness of philosophy. Finally, how could things be otherwise? Science is flourishing today, and its good conscience shines in its face, while that too, which the whole of modern philosophy has gradually sunk, this remnant of philosophy, arouses distrust and displeasure when it does not arouse mockery and pity. Philosophy reduced to theory of knowledge, actually no more than a timid epicism and abstinence doctrine. A philosophy that does not even get over the threshold and painfully denies itself the right of entry. That is philosophy at its last gasp, an end, an agony, something that arouses pity. How could such a philosophy rule? Aphorism 204. No, 205. The perils in the way of the evolution of the philosopher are in truth so manifold today, one may well doubt whether this fruit can still ripen at all. The compass and towering building of science has grown enormous, and therewith the probability has also grown enormous that the philosopher will become wary while still no more than a learner, or that he will let himself be stopped somewhere and specialize, so that he will never reach his proper height, the height from which he can survey, look around, and look down, or that he will reach his height too late, when his height at the best time is past, and his best strength spent, or damaged, coerced, degenerated, so that his view, his total value judgment, no longer means much. Perhaps it is the very refinement of his intellectual conscience which makes him linger on the way, arrive late, and he fears he may be seduced into dilettantism, into becoming an insect with 1,000 foot and 1,000 antennae. He knows too well that one who has lost respect for himself can no longer command, can no longer lead as a man of knowledge, either unless he wants to become a great actor, a philosophical Calextrio, and Pied Piper of the Spirit. In short, a misleader. This is ultimately a question of taste, even if it were not a question of conscience. In addition to this, so as to re- redouble his difficulties, there is in fact that the philosopher demands of himself a judgment, a yes or no, not in regard to the science, but in regard to life and the value of life. That he is reluctant to believe he has a right, to say nothing of a duty, to come to such a judgment, and has to find his way to this right. and this faith. Only through the widest, perhaps most disturbing and shattering experiences, and often hesitating, doubting, and being struck dumb. Indeed, the mob has long confounded and confused the philosopher with someone else, whether with the man of the science, or with the religiously exalted, dead to the senses, dead to the world, fanatic, and drunkard of God. And today, if one hears anyone command for living wisely or like a philosopher, it means hardly more than prudently and apart. Wisdom that seems to be rabble, to be a kind of flight, an artifact, and means for getting oneself out of the dangerous game. But the genuine philosopher, as he seems to us, my friends, lives unphilosophical and unwise, above all, imprudent, and bears the burden and duty of 100 attempts and temptations of life. He risks himself constantly. He plays the dangerous game. Aphorism 206. In comparison with a genius, that is to say, with a being which neither begets or bears, both words taken in their most comprehensive sense, the scholar, the average man of science, always has something of the old maid about him, for, like her, he has no acquaintanceship with the two most valuable functions of mankind, to both whom, indeed, the scholar and to the old maid, one concedes respectability, one by one the way of compensation as it were. One emphasizes the respectability in these cases, and experiences the same feeling of annoyance and at having been constrained to this concession. Let us look more closely. What is the man of science? An ignoble species of man, for a start, with the virtues of an ignoble, that is to say, subservient, unauthoritative, and unself-sufficient species of man. He possesses industriousness, patient acknowledgment of his proper place in the rank and file, uniformity and moderation in abilities and requirements. He possesses the instinct for his own kind, and for that fact his own kind have need of, for example, that little bit of independence and green pasture without which there is no quiet work, that claim to honor and recognition, which first and foremost presupposes recognizability, that sunshine of a good name, that constant affirmation of his value and his utility, with which his inner distrust, the dregs of the heart of all dependent men and of herd animals, again and again to be overcome. The scholar also possesses, as it only to be expected, the diseases and little breeding of an ignoble species. He is full of pity, envy, and has very keen eyes for what is base in those natures to whose heights he is unable to rise. He is trusting, but only like one who sometimes lets himself go, but never lets himself flow out. And it is precisely in the pretense of humans who do flow out that he becomes the more frosty and reserved. His eye is then like a reluctant smooth lake, whose surface is disturbed by no ripple of delight or sympathy. The worst and most dangerous thing of which a scholar is capable comes from the instinct of mediocrity which characterizes his species, from that Jesuitism of mediocrity which instinctively works for the destruction of the uncommon man and tries to break, or, better still, relax every bent bow, or relaxing, with consideration, with indulgent hand, naturally, relaxing the importunate pity that is the true art of Jesuitism, which has always understood how to introduce itself as the religion of pity. Welcome, everyone. First, how's your day? Mine I'm vividly remembering watching the American and Canadian hockey game. It was sheer belligerence on both sides and of political and national disesteem by individuals booing, scornfully booing the singer and the Americans amid their anthem. Politics and games aside, it's time to discuss the artistic style of belligerence inside Nietzsche. Part 6 begins, as we scholars, as he previously said, but that they moralize in here to prove to what is always been. And he uses a French word. He uses a a a French novelist and playwright, the of Balzac. Balzac, he says here, in the Montrer ses plaies, which is show his wounds. Now, who is Balzac? As I said earlier, he's a French novelist and a playwright, but his entire name is Henri de Balzac. And from this, it becomes a dismay, or undismayed experience of this person who is showing evidence of moralization. He continues forward of this that one ventures to combat a harmful and improper displacement of the order of rank between science and philosophy, which is quite unnoticed and which only serves with a perfect good conscience, threatening to become established. Now, the good conscience in this sense isn't the one that he's criticizing. The good conscience in this sense, the one that would criticize, he would name as bad conscience. Good conscience in this sense is the one who establishes an order of rank by the Monsieur ses planes, okay, aka showing his wounds through the order of rank and pathos of distance. But in this situation, there's no order of rank between science and philosophy. Thus, the good conscience is quelled, even threatened to become established. In this sense, he adds experience. He says, why doesn't all people experience bad experience? Does not always come to that conclusion. Continues forward that one can acquire the right to speak on a higher question of rank. Otherwise, one would talk like a blind man about colors, or like women and artists against science. Oh, this wicked science, their modesty and instincts say, or not say, sigh. Quote, it always exposes the facts. To simply say, these blind individuals, these women and artists, become sensitive to the evocative information that is shown before them, aka arguing with a fool is a fool's errand. And then he says the Declaration of Independence, that's similar, of the man of science. His emancipation from philosophy is one of the most subtle after effects of the democratic form and formlessness of life. The self-glorification and presumption of said scholar, wherever it is in full bloom, and at the same time its finest springtime. What is the man of science? Nietzsche defines it in Aphorism 205, 206, which simply says, what is the man of science? Someone who's the ignoble species of man, for a start, the virtues of an ignoble, who's subservient, unauthoritative, and not self-sufficient form of species of man. He possesses industriousness, patient acknowledgement of his proper place and rank and file, uniformity and moderation in abilities and requirements. He possesses the instinct for his own kind and for that which is his own kind have need of, for example, that little bit of independence and green pasture, while at the same time, with no quiet work, claims to honor and recognition, or the foremost presumed recognizability, that the sunshine of a good name, the constant affirmation of his value, his utility, but with his inner mistrust, or distrust in this sense. The dregs of his heart of a dependent man, the herd animal, have again and again to be overcome. So that's Nietzsche's definition of the science, a man of science. We can use that phrase and reword it to an egalitarian, or simply a subservient individual. I'll use both, but in the context that Nietzsche presents, we'll use the man of science. And he says that creates a after effect. What's the after effect? He says it's the democratic form of the formless and formlessness of life, aka creating something from illusory and organic to a collective reality and organic matter in the full bloom and springtime of democratic philosophy, which this person has emancipated himself of conservative philosophy. Now it becomes a self glorification and a stance for the scholar. And he'll define the scholar in this sense, in this aphorism thing. He continues forward that what does not mean to say that in this form of self-praise smells sweetly, quote, away with all the masters. That is what the plebeian instinct desires here too. And now that that science has most successfully resisted theology, whose handmaid it was for too long, it is now, with great high spirits and plentiful lack of understanding, taken it upon itself to lay down laws for philosophy, and for once to play the master. Oh, what am I saying? To play the philosopher itself. His brief humor. Oh, did I say master? I meant to say philosopher. Away with all the masters is what he says as a plebeian instinct. Get rid of these people, these authoritative hierarchical people. We want equality. We want an egalitarian state. We want an organic, simple, mediocre, herd style life. He prescribes this as the last man, but this is a future endeavor among the bad conscience of individuals. That conscience includes guilt, but the actions of performing said bad conscience, and resentment, jealousy, envy, etc., etc. While continuing in observing this aphorism before we continue with the next one, he's describing a form of self-glorification in the sense of we, or his virtues, are true, while others are false. I will take away those people. I will put them aside, for I know what's best. And they know what is worse, what is evil, what is forbidden, what is sinful. But he adds the democratic form and formlessness. That immediately implies the man of science. Not imply, but apply the man of science, who, as we defined earlier, is involved is involved of dependent collective knowledge of one another for honor and recognition. I immediately think the Enlightenment, where the individuals of that time were avid of denouncing the existence of God, while not using that evidence to show the existence of God. I tie that with this sentence of now that science has most successfully resisted theology, whose handmaid it was for too long, and it is now, with the great high spirits and a plentiful lack of understanding, taken upon itself to lay down laws for philosophy. He continues forward, my memory of a man of science, if I may say so, is full of arrogant naiveties, and I have heard about philosophy and philosophers from young scientists and old physicians, not to speak of the most cultured and conceited of all scholars, the philologists and schoolmen, who are both by profession. So that justifies what I was saying earlier of the democratic Enlightenment men, or people among that time, which Nietzsche is criticizing these scholars as men of science, who are arrogant, naive individuals, both from the field of psychology, philosophy, science, and psychiatry, and why he said earlier of the order of rank, where it becomes a venture to combat a harmful and improper displacement of said order of rank between science and philosophy. The order of rank in this situation is on a individual level upon how that individual presumes the judgment that's presented forward in the name of abstract ideas, knowledge, absolute truth, and absolute knowledge, etc., etc. But he continues forward. Now it has the specialist and jabbing workman who's instinctively opposed synthetic undertakings and capacities in general. Now the industrious labor who had a scent of the odium and noble luxury in the philosopher's physical economy, and felt wrong and not dismissed, but diminished by it, aka the common individual who can't comprehend this odium practitioner, or the philosopher who has this noble luxuriantness and practices odium or leisure time. For the industrious labor, including the man of science, it's they sense it as sinful, and they renounce this form of utility for for accepting blind faith of said odium and noble virtues or luxury. And he says this presents the color blindness of this utility man, who sees nothing in philosophy but a series of refuted systems, dialogues, and is disgusted with this mysticism from a fear of these frontiers of knowledge, who leaped out, now a disrespect for an individual philosopher who had voluntarily generalized itself into a disrespect for philosophy. Now he's altering the situation of philosopher in this sense is the one who investigates through life and disciplined decisions for their heightening of themselves. This is what he's speaking of, where the fear of a disgust or disguised mysticism and rectification of knowledge. And this shows the disrespect of the individual philosopher and his philosophy, contra to the beliefs and wasteful expenditures of other philosophies. Quote, I found most frequently among young scholars was that behind an arrogant disdain for philosophy there lay the evil after effect of a philosopher himself, from whom they had to be sure withdrawn their allegiance, without, however, having got free from the spell of his disparaging evaluation of other philosophers. His self-reproach or renunciation of his philosophy for the mass arrogant disdain of philosophy became a evil after effect among the populace. And among the populace, this this personal philosophy of theirs, not of the populace, but the philosopher himself inside the community, he withdrew his allegiance and his evaluation of other philosophies for a disparaging one. Thus, he committed the act of a scorpion stinging itself with its spike, not spike, with its tail, with its spiked tail. There, he he enters an example of this ill humor after effect or evil after effect with Schopenhauer. That with the Schopenhauer Hegel feud in philosophy, this is a infamous, infamous, I say, feud of Schopenhauer criticizing Hegel's. Well, the criticism comes from envy and jealousy of a large audience attending Hegel's lectures, contra to Schopenhauer's orchestrated but failed lectures on philosophy. And he said, "You inept charlatan and philosophanter, you are nothing but rabble." And this feud continued for multiple years till the death of Hegel. And he just says this too with his success and disconnect. Well, he says this too with his unintelligent rage against Hegel. But here's his criticism of Hegel. He succeeded in disconnecting the entire last generation of Germans from German culture, of which all was at the high point in the vinery refinement of historical sense. But Schopenhauer himself, while in the point of view of a genius, was a unreceptive and un-German and respected poor person. This is relevant to one of the aphorisms in part 1 where where Germany was possessed, spiritually possessed from romanticism. They utterly absorbed the overflowing impact of romanticism till the German idealists Stelling, Kant, and Hegel, another German idealist, who, in a historical scope, or not scope, but scale, disentangled and mutilated this young, spirited, thriving, and overwhelming vitality position in German culture. From concepts of absolute knowledge of Hegel, thing in itself, categorical imperative, majestic edifices, I think it's moral majestic edifices, and of Kant, and for Schelling it was the absolute intuition. And Nietzsche, if you read previous or watched the previous parts of Beyond Good and Evil, criticizes them respectfully. Not a respectful argument, but me saying I respect him for criticizing what I thought was disparaging of the human instincts. He includes that, broadly speaking, it may be above all too human. No, all too human element. In short, the poverty of the most recent philosophy has been prejudically to respect for philosophy has been opened the gates of the instinct of the plebeian, because the previous generation was overwhelmed with the emotions, the body, with women and art, music, etc., etc. The prejudice to once it was respected the philosophy is now became spite. This spite unlocked the gates of that instinct to the plebeians. It became common. He adds, for one must admit how completely a different species of Heraclitus, Plato, and Empedocles. Who's Empedocles? Empedocles is another pre-Socratic philosopher, including Heraclitus, Parmenides, Thales, and Anaxagoras, respected pre-Socratic philosophers. Whoever else had these royal and splendid hermits of the spirit were called is lacking in our modern world. A degree in face of such representatives of philosophy, thanks to fashion at present, and completely top at a completely abysmal descent of species for the worthy man of science. To simply say, he's not lamenting nor mourning, but frustrated that among the ancient world it was thriving with philosophers, scientists, historians, um, mathematicians, etc., including the Olympian men and competitors among that time, comparing that to modernity of his time and modernity of our time. It's lacking the Olympian spirit and thumos among us. Just a partial deviation. Just play with the imagination of transporting to the time of Heraclitus, or Plato, or Socrates, or ancient Greece period, either of its uh, tyrant government or democracy democracy government. Who's concerned if it's the dark, golden, or intermediate phases of those two ages of Greece? Just transport your imagination to that. I do sometimes. Now, in the particular sense, the sight of those hodgepodge philosophers who are called themselves philosophers of reality and positivists, a 180, positivism is where unconditional evidence has unconditional truths. It's a philosophy dependent on science, which is capable of implementing a perilous, serious mistrust of the soul of an ambitious young scholar. Soul in this sense is passion, joy, jubilation, etc., etc. And these positivists and realist philosophers are implementing and plaguing these young scholars of the Romantic era, and and the continual generations where young individuals are being influenced from their gullible and inept young mind. I, for one example, and to have guilt, man. Just thinking of this, I'm reminiscing of the times where I experienced the same deceit, the same mistrust, and the same perilous, um, the same perilous situations where I was taught to to whip, to punish, and to renounce the soul of ambition inside of me. This is the same on a parallel and similar level as Nietzsche saw of his time, including in his youth from his Lutheran pastor father. Excuse me. Then he adds, now that these gentlemen, these scholars and specialists of themselves, this fact is palpable. It's palpable for multiple millennia, that all defeated men, one and all, were brought back under the sway of science at the same time, or another were demanded more of themselves, more than than intended because of responsibility that goes around, and who now honorably, wrathfully, vengefully represents by word and deed the unbelief in the lordly task and lordliness of philosophy. Finally, how could things be otherwise? Science is flourishing today, and it's excuse me, good science, good conscience shines in its face. Let that all gradually sink in as the remnant of philosophy arouses distrust and displeasure, when it does not arouse mockery and pity, because philosophy now is reduced to a theory of knowledge, actually no more than a timid epicism and abstinence doctrine, a painful denying through the threshold of an entry, that is, philosophy at its last gasp, end, agony, something that arouses pity. How could such a philosophy rule? And among me discussing Aphorism 204, we at the same time we critiqued the entirety of 2000 of 205 and 206. Primarily primarily the respectability and the ignoble species and reckonability of the man of science. But before we conclude for today, this final part of 2000 of this 204 aphorism is with his observation of science. Remember, he's not lamenting nor grieving. He's simply saying that in this good conscience, the sun, this, the illuminating sun shows in its face of this flourishing science that it has gradually repressed philosophy to distrust and displeasure, a theory of knowledge and of pity. If mediocrity and pity worked illicit or aroused, that he says, in the time of this distrust and displeasure. Because now, as he's to say, quote, it's been reduced to timid epicism, aka special moments in history, and abstinent doctrine. Abstinent of bodily doctrine, where the instincts are suffocated to to this to this trapped imprisoned soul, willing to escape and become a free spirit on unself-sufficient levels. Abstinence in this sense is suffocating, and that this threshold painfully denies itself the entry. Now, philosophy is at the gasp, an end, an agony. And he's realizing that this manifestation of a perilous doctrine is infesting the minds of, well, his generation, previous generations, and after his death, and these generations, this modernity, where, quote, a genius, that is to say, a being which either begets nor bears, both words taken in the most comprehensive sense, becomes an average scholar, man of science, always has something of the old maid about him. For that, like her, he lacks the acquaintanceship with the most valuable functions of mankind. And that this science of the man of science emphasizes the respectability of cases of experiencing the same feeling of annoyance and having been constrained to this session. And among this man of science, he associates it with Jesuitism. Jesuits are the Christians who knock door to door of enlightening individuals of Christ. He shows this as the quote the quote himself. The worst and most dangerous thing of which is a scholar who is capable from the instincts of mediocrity characterized in his species, as if from the Jesuitism of mediocrity, which instinctively works for the destruction of the uncommon man and tries to break, or, better still, relax every bent bow, because every relaxation involves an indulgent hand, which naturally relaxes for the important unimportant pity that is the true art of Jesuitism, which has always been understood as the introduction of the religion of pity. There's a link in the description to the Men's Academy. My name's Gregory. Amor fati. Love your faith.